this video, we're covering Nexus Repository. Nexus provides repositories for a range of technologies like Yum and apt repos, Docker images, NPM repositories, Ruby gems, the list goes on. And it's popular in corporate settings, especially in air-gapped architecture where there's no access to the internet. But it also provides a really nice proxy service where Nexus downloads from the public repos and then caches those files, and it delivers future files from its cache if they're available until that cache expires. It has some other features up its sleeve as well, and we'll cover those in the video. So if you want to learn how to install and configure Nexus, work with hosted, proxy and group repos, and manage Nexus users and roles, then keep watching. I'm going to be using Hetzner cloud servers in this video. If you want to follow along using the same, there's a link in the description that will give you €20 of free Hetzner credit, and it helps me to keep making these videos. And I'm just in the servers section of Hetzner. I'm going to click on to add server. I'm going to choose the default location for this server of Helsinki. For the image, I'm going to choose CentOS Stream 8. It's a standard image rather than dedicated. Prices are a lot cheaper. Obviously, it's shared cores, but that's fine for me. I'm going to choose CX21. I found that Nexus requires at least 4 GB of memory to start up. Once it's started, it's absolutely fine. It doesn't use all 4 GB, but to start up, it needs at least 4. Obviously, if you're in a busy production environment and it's getting a lot of traffic, you might need more than 4 GB. But I'm going to stick with the CX21. For networking, don't need IPv6, do need IPv4, which gives us a public IP. And we will use a private network later on when we do some testing. But I'm not going to add that yet. I will add that later. I've already selected my default key is already selected. If you want to add a key, just click add SSH key, paste your public key here, and then if you want it to be automatically selected when you create a new server, just click the set as default key, and then by default, and you can have more than one default key, but any default keys will be pre-selected when you create a new server. You can always unselect them, but it just saves forgetting. Volumes, we are going to need a volume. It's best practice with Nexus to store the repo data, repository data on a separate volume. It makes backups easier, and it's also easier to expand a dedicated volume as and when you need to. So I'm going to click on create volume. 10 GB for this demo is fine. I'm going to name it Nexus, although Nexus isn't the name that will appear in the VM. You'll see what it looks like. It's a well, you'll see anyway when we go in the VM and we look at the name of the volume. But this name here relates to the name that we'll see in the Hetzner web GUI. ext4 is fine, and it's going to have to create it in Helsinki if it wants to be attached to the server that's also in Helsinki. So I'm going to click on create and buy. I'll start up in a minute. We don't need anything else. I'm just going to name the server Nexus. I should start in a second. There we go. Server's created, volume is attached. We're going to need the IP address to SSH to it. It's dead easy. Just click the IP and it'll just copy it. Let's start a new terminal. And SSH, the default account is root. Obviously, I advise you to change that. For this demo, I'm just going to leave. I'm just going to use root, but you should create a new user that's got sudo access and SSH as that user after you've done the initial setup. Okay, so first thing we'll do is an update. Okay, so now that the update's complete, there's a few apps that I know I need to have installed that won't be available on this default CentOS 8 installation, and they are Nano, and we're also going to need tar. So Nano and tar. Oh. Okay. Now Nexus is a Java app, so we're going to install. First thing we're going to do is install Java or version 8 Open JDK. And Nexus comes as a tar file rather than a Yum install. So we're going to create a folder called app on the root of the server and then cd into there. And then we'll use wget to fetch the Nexus tar file. And then we'll untar that. If we just have a look, we've got this Nexus-3.45.1 blah blah. All I want is a Nexus folder, so I'm going to move that to just Nexus. It gives us plain folder. And next, we need to make sure that Nexus runs as a non-root user. So we're going to create a user called Nexus, and then we need to set the permissions on both this Nexus folder and the Sonatype work folder to be so that they're owned by the user. So we'll do add user Nexus, and then we'll say chown Nexus Nexus. So we're saying the user and the group ownership of the Nexus. The user and the group ownership should be Nexus of the Nexus folder. And then chown Nexus of Sonatype work. And while we're at it, setting permissions, we do df-h. This is the volume that we created when we set the server up. So I want to create a folder inside of that mount called Nexus, and I also want to chown that folder as well. That's where all the data for Nexus is going to live. And made one small mistake there. We need to be sure that when we did the chown, that we use the $R flag on the chown of the Nexus folder and the Sonatype work. Otherwise, only the top level folder will have the ownership of Nexus. We need to have all these subfolders and files also owned by Nexus, and that is what the $R does. It's recursive. Okay, so now we need to tell Nexus that we want it to use that Nexus user to run with. So we do that with, in the Nexus folder. Remember, we're in the /app at the moment, and then we've got this Nexus folder, and there's a file called nexus.rc. Maybe there isn't. It's in. Right, so let's just show you the full path. It's in app nexus bin nexus.rc. There we go. And we need to just uncomment. There's only a single line in here. Just uncomment the line, and then we put into the quotes here the name of the user that we want Nexus to run as. Save that. And we also want to tell Nexus to use this location for its storage. So I'm just going to copy that, and then in that same folder, add nexus.rc in /bin. There is a nexus.vm options, and down in this data option, everything after the equals, that's where we want to put the path to the folder on our custom volume. Save that. And next we need to create a service so that Nexus runs automatically. So I'm going to create a service in systemd system, and then we'll call it nexus.service. And what we want to go in there is, so I'm going to save that and exit. And now we just need to start the service. Assuming we've done everything right, it will start up correctly. So we use systemctl start Nexus, and then systemctl enable Nexus. We'll make sure the service is enabled and that Nexus starts automatically whenever the VM is rebooted. And we can then do a status, systemctl status of Nexus, and it says it's running. Now by default, Nexus runs on port 8081. So let's open a browser and see if we can access it. Now this is only going to be on HTTP. Obviously you would normally put a reverse proxy in front of this and then use SSL termination, perhaps with Let's Encrypt, and then you would be able to access their Nexus over HTTPS. For this demonstration, I'm just going to use HTTP, and the port that we want is, the IP we want. I'm going to copy again from here, paste that in, and it's 8081. Okay, so first thing we need to do now is to get the default password. If we click on sign in, it will tell us, there we go. It's actually saved to the default, to the custom volume. It's cut off at the end there, but I'll just copy up to there. And then the rest is admin.password. So if we cat admin.password, there is the password, the default password for admin. If we copy that back to the browser, username admin, paste that password in, and then sign in. And we're taken through a very quick setup process, which basically just asks us to change the password. And we'll also ask us, do we want to enable anonymous access? In this case, I do. If you don't enable anonymous access, then when you're trying to access things like a Yum repository, you would have to include in the yum repos.d, and then the repo file, you would have to include a username and a password in there. I don't want that. I just want to be able to access the files. And by the way, having it as enable anonymous doesn't make anonymous access to the GUI. It's only to the files at the back end, to the repositories, which is anonymous. So next and finish. And so that's us logged in and the admin password set. Right, the next thing we'll do is we'll create a new repository. So we go into the admin section, which is this cog, and then we click onto repositories. Then we can click on to create a repository. If we scroll all the way down to the bottom, I want to create a Yum Proxy repository. Now we've got group, hosted, and proxy. I'll cover the group in a second, but the proxy effectively is we're going to be pulling files from the internet, but once they've been pulled, they will be cached on Nexus. And until that cache expires, any other requests for that same file will be pulled direct from Nexus rather than Nexus going back out to the internet. So if you did have a lot of servers to update, rather than hitting a remote internet-based repository maybe 100 times for, if you're doing an update on a lot of servers, Nexus will only hit that external repository once initially, get the files that are required, and then all other further requests will just come direct from Nexus. So that's what we'll do first. We'll set up a proxy-based, and I'm going to call this CentOS, and we'll call it CentOS Base OS. Right, so if we open up a new tab and we just look for CentOS 8 mirror list, and then we can find a mirror that's closest to us. So I'm going to type United Kingdom. So I'm going to choose this HTTP mirror. And we want to look for 8-stream. We want the base OS. We want the x86-64. And then OS. And then if we copy that path, we come back into Nexus. That's our remote storage. So we'll paste that in, and that's all that we need to put in. And then create repository. And then we'll do the same for AppStream. It's 86 OS. Copy that. And I'll keep closing the browser. Create repository. Yum Proxy. AppStream. Paste that URL in. Create repository. And those are our two repositories now created. What we can now do is we go back into Hetzner and create a new server. We only need a small one, so let's go for CentOS Stream 8 again. We'll just choose the base CX11 and we'll give it IPv4, SSH key. We don't need a volume or anything else, and we'll just call this, let's call it VM1. We'll use this for making sure that Nexus is working, and just to demonstrate, I'm going to copy that IP address. Open my terminal again. And where we want to go to yum.repos.d. And what we can do is if we just do a remove -f on all, I'll get rid of everything that's in there. Now, if we tried now to do if I do yum make cache, and then if I do yum update, you'll see that that's not going to work because we don't have any repos enabled. So I'm going to create a new one. So I'm going to vi, and also if I was to do yum install nano, you'll find that won't work either. So we'll be stuck with vi until we've got Nexus added as a repo. So vi, and we'll just call it CentOS.repo. We're going to put 2 entries in here. CentOS, let's just call it base OS, and the name will be Nexus CentOS base OS, and the base URL will be, we can find that from, go back into the browser, and if we go into the base OS, we can find the URL here. So this is the URL to this base OS repository on our Nexus server. And enabled, I want as 1. GPG check, I want to set as 0. That should be enough to get base OS working, and then we just want the same, but for, we go back to repositories, AppStream, copy the URL. And save. And then we run yum make cache. Okay, we should now, if I just show you, actually, if we go back to home page of Nexus and we click on to browse, and then we click on, for instance, base OS, we've got repo data in there, but you can see there's no packages. If we go into AppStream, again, we've got repo data. So this is all being downloaded from those from CentOS, but there are no packages. We go back and we type yum install nano, and let's put tar on here as well. Enter. You can see it's going to pull these from the base OS. Say yes. If we go back into the browser and we're going to base OS, you can now see we've got packages. You see we've got nano and tar. So they've been pulled from the external CentOS repo and cached. So any future calls will just come direct from these until that cache has expired. And I think the default is 1 day. You can see the default. If you go into settings, repositories, and we go into here, we can see down here the component age. So how long in minutes? So that's 1 day, I believe. 1,440 minutes. So obviously you can lengthen or shortage that. You can lengthen or lengthen or shorten that. Yeah. Obviously, it would be quicker. It would be better to set up a network. So if I click on to create network and access Nexus over the local network rather than the public network. So if I just go create network, I'm not going to bother creating a subnet, although there is a default subnet by default when you create one on Hetzner, but it's the full range of IPs. And if I go into, well, in fact, go into the network again and into resources and attach resources, and say I want the Nexus and the VM, and then add servers. There we go. So Nexus server is on 10.0.0.2. So we go back into the VM and if we nano the repo and say 10.0.0.2 10.0.0.2. I'm going to save that. I might have to restart Nexus because I imagine it won't be listening on that new IP address until it gets restarted. But let's see. Let's make the cache. Yum make cache. Oh no, it did. It's automatically listening on there. So yeah, so we should now be able to do Yum update, for instance. And with a Yum update, you'll find that obviously it'll download a lot more files into the. If we go into browse and base OS packages, you'll see it's starting to pull a lot more packages with that update. This is where the real power, the real benefit of Nexus comes in. When you've got all those files that need to be downloaded, you can just download them once, have them cached, and then just pull them all across the local network in the future. Okay, so that update is done. We should see now in Nexus, we've got a few packages in AppStream, but as you can imagine, inside base OS, there's a hell of a lot more. Okay, so next thing we'll look at, if we go back into the server administration and click on repositories again and create repository, we'll look at the Yum hosted. Now, Yum hosted repository is similar to Proxy repository, except for rather than reaching out to the internet, these are just well, this is what it says. It's a hosted repository on this Nexus server, so it only it hosts the files that we put on it rather than it going and getting them from somewhere else. So we'll create a hosted repository and we will call this one MariaDB. And repository depth, I want to set it as 0. The way repository depth works is that if you select, say, 2, then you would have to have a folder structure that had at least a folder depth of 2 in order for it to create the repo data in. And if you didn't have that, then that would be an error. You just wouldn't be able to update. I like to leave it at 0, and that's where the because in this case I'm just going to be creating MariaDB inside the root folder of the repository. So I'm going to create that repository. If we just go into MariaDB again, this is the path to it. I'm going to copy, and what we need to do now is to get the RPM files that we want to put on that repository. So I'm going to make a folder called MariaDB, And then I'm going to yum install MariaDB -- download only, and then -- download dir MariaDB. And what this will do is it will find all the dependencies as though it was going to install MariaDB, but rather than actually installing them, it will only download them, and it will place them in the download dir, which we've set as MariaDB. So if I now go into MariaDB, you can see we've got quite a number of them. So how do we get those onto Nexus? Well, if we go into Nexus and we were to go back to the home page, we've got this option for upload. You can see we could choose MariaDB. The only problem is with this option is that you can only upload a single file at a time. If I click on Browse, and in fact I can't even do that because it's on the a remote VM, so I can't browse to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use curl. Now what we need to do is to do a basically loop around all the files that are in this folder, and then put them onto the Nexus server. So we can do that for file in star, and then a colon, and then do curl, and I think it's -- upload file, or it could be upload - file maybe. I can't quite remember, but if it doesn't work, we can work it out. And where we want to in fact, we need to put file there. So we want to upload whatever is in the value of file. That will be $file. And we want to HTTP, want to put the path to our repository. So I can't remember if I copied it or not. MariaDB, this one. And it will be / and then the file name. Oh. $file. And then exclamation, and then a semicolon, and done. Let's see if this works. I don't think it did. Okay, so I forgot what I need to do is -v, which will give us verbose, and then I need to add the user. So this is going to be admin, and then my password. Let's have a look. That looks to have worked. We go back into Nexus and we browse MariaDB. We can see we've got all those files. So how do we install them? Well, we need to, similar as we did before, we're going to etc yum.repos.d, and then if we mkdir, let's call it nano, let's say databases.repo, because we could have more than one database. We'll just have that as a single repository. So we'll call this one MariaDB. Enabled equals 1, and GPG check equals 0. So it's got the name, the base URL enabled, and GPG check. Save that, and then yum make cache. And we should be able to do yum install MariaDB. There we go. And that is installed. So that's how we use Nexus for a hosted repository for Yum. Let's now have a look at using Docker, because that's another common use case for Nexus. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install Docker on this machine. Okay, so that's Docker installed. So it's not started by default. So systemctl start Docker, systemctl enable Docker, status. Okay, that's now running. Right, so let's create a proxy repository to Docker now. We do that if we go back into Nexus, into administration, to repositories, and let's create a new repository looking for Docker as a proxy. I'm going to call this Docker Hub. I'm going to create a separate port for this. We'll just put it on 8085. And we need to put a check in here to allow anonymous Docker pull. If you've got the latest version of Nexus, you'll see this. In some older versions, this wasn't on there, so you might not see it. But in the newer versions, you have to specifically tell Nexus that you're going to allow anonymous pulling from Nexus. Now, the remote storage, that's going to be just... It's because we're using Docker Hub, which is the most common. They have given the URL here. If you were using something other than Docker Hub, then obviously that would be different for you. And we need to then tell it which index to use. So we're going to tell it to use the index on Docker Hub. I think that is it. That should be fine. That's the repository created within Nexus. There's a couple of things that we have to do. Well, there's one thing that we have to do within Nexus, or sorry, within our client, and that is we need to create a file that doesn't exist by default with Docker. So that's in etc docker, and then it's called daemon.json. Because our repository is running as HTTP and not HTTPS, we have to add the repository to say that it is insecure and that we're happy for Docker to use it. Obviously, if you're using HTTPS, then you wouldn't need to do this. So we're running on port 8085. And once we've done that, we need to just restart Docker. And we should now be able to, if we do Docker image ls, you'll see we have no images. And also if we go to browse our Docker Hub repository, you'll see it's empty at the moment. what we have to do is we have to say docker pull, and then we have to give the host of our repository. So in this case 10.0.0.2 port 8085 and then MySQL. Okay, if we now go into Nexus and browse to Docker Hub, you can see now in the library we've got MySQL latest version. So that's how easy it is to set up a proxied repository to a Docker Hub in Nexus. Right, so let's now create a Docker hosted repository, and to do that we'll go into the admin section of Nexus. We'll create a new repository. We need the Docker hosted recipe. I'm just going to call this Docker hosted. I'm going to give it a new port of 8086, and I'm going to say that anonymous Docker pulls are allowed. And I think that's it. Now, I'm going to create the repository. Although anonymous pulls are allowed, we can't push to this repository without having a user account that has the correct permissions. So let's first of all create a new role that we can assign to a user to use that to be able to push to that repository. So let's create the role. I'm going to create a Nexus role and we'll call it Docker hosted push. So that's the ID, and then we'll call it the actual role name, Docker hosted push. A role description, can push to the Docker hosted repo. Now, the privileges that are needed, there's about 4 of them, I believe. So we want, if I type Docker hosted, because there's a lot in there, so I'll just filter it down. And I'll come down to the view section. You can't see all the information on the width of this, but if you hover over, you can. We need, as a minimum, to be able to log in and to be able to push, we need the Docker hosted add. We need the Docker hosted browse. We need the Docker hosted edit, and might just be those 3 actually. Yeah, I think it's just those 3. So we've got add, browse, and edit. I think that should do. If we need any more, we can always come back and add them. We'll click save. Now we'll create a user. So create a local user. So the username will be Simon. Put my details in. And the status is active. Here's the role that we just created. So I'm going to add that to my user and then click create user. And now we should be able to log in. So Docker login at 10. In fact, actually, what the first thing we need to do is we need to edit the Docker daemon file. Because we'll create this new repository and we need to tell Docker that we're happy for it to be insecure. Save that, exit, and then we need to restart Docker. And now Docker login. It was port 8086. Okay, unauthorized. Login attempt failed. So I must be missing a permission. So let's just go back to roles, Docker hosted push, and see what we are missing. Docker hosted read. I believe that's the one that we need to. I thought there was 4. So I think if I save that now, that should allow me to log in. There we go. So logged in. Let's clear that. And let's now build a very, very simple Docker file just to show how we can create a Docker file and then push it to Nexus. So let's make a folder called Docker and then Nginx custom. And then we'll create a Docker file. And just really simple, we'll just say from Nginx, and that should be good enough. And if we now build that, Docker build, and let's tag it with our repository. Tag it as the latest. And then dot for the current folder to build from this Docker file we've just created. It's created as simple as that. So let's Docker push latest. And there we go. So if we now go back into browsing the repositories and we look at our Docker hosted, we can see we've now got this Nginx custom image. Now, one last type of repository that Nexus offers that I want to show you is a group repository. So if we look at the 2 Docker repositories that we've got, Docker hosted and Docker hub, a user would have to point to each individual one and remember where a particular image was located. You might have multiple internal private repositories. Now, if you just want, there's a way with a group, we can bring all these together into a single repository and just have users forget about the fact that there's lots of different repositories and just point to a single group. So it's very easy to create. You click create repository. We're going to choose a Docker group. We'll call this Docker all. I'm going to give it a new port. We'll say it's 8087. We're going to allow anonymous Docker pulls. And then down here we've got the group, the member repositories. So we just select the repositories that we want to be part of this group. So I'm going to add both Docker hub and Docker hosted. And then I'm going to create repository. And then again, we need to edit the Docker daemon. So to tell it because it's an insecure repository. So add that, port 8087, save the file, restart Docker. And now we should be able to Docker pull 10.0.0.2 8087. And then the name of the image. Now, whether or not that exists on Docker Hub or whether or not it's on one of our local repositories. So for instance, we've got the custom Nginx repository that we just created. So Nginx custom. So it's just pulled the latest version of that. So it connected and it found it. But we could also pull, let's go to Docker Hub, and let's search for kubectl, and so it's Bitnami kubectl. So let's again pull from that port 8087 on Nexus server, but we'll just paste in Bitnami kubectl. And as you can see, that is getting pulled. And if we go back to Nexus and we browse Docker Hub, and there is the Bitnami image. Well, that's all I have for you in this video. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I get back to everyone. If you like my content, please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and click the bell icon to be notified when I release future videos. Until the next one, many thanks for watching, and stay well and keep learning.